If you precast, do we think Shylock, ethical dissent, and the precarious intellectual? Debunking the Judaism of 21st century Shylockian psychology is the focality of this paper, which will ultimately shed light on the humanitarian faceted motif of these archdevil, anti-hero, and anarchical antagonists from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice. For the Shakespeare Quarterly essay entitled Shylock and the Slaves, Owing and Owning in The Merchant of Venice, Amanda Bailey comments on Shylock's institutional marginality is akin to the institutional scapegoating of coercive movement, enforced conversion, deterrable spirituality, and interracial miscegenation until reintegration into the fabric of Venetian society as expostulated from unsettlements of unbelongingness. Once the case comes to trial, Portia is the first to admit this bond is forfeit, and lawfully by this the Jew may claim a pound of flesh, acknowledging before the court that Shylock's claim over Antonio is not a deviation from that jurisprudence, but an amplification of its proprietary logic. The persuasive energy of Shylock's comparing Antonio as a slave may also be fueled by retributive anger. Early in the play, Shylock had admonished Antonio for humiliating him by spitting upon my Jewish gabardine in retaliation for the use of for that which is mine own. From Shylock's perspective, Antonio erroneously assumed that Shylock's money is a fungible form of property, which he uses but does not own. Antonio's inability or refusal to recognize Shylock as a proprietor, in effect, strips Shylock of the entitlements to status that these may entail. Shylock responds to this misprision by performing, as Antonio sees him, as a person dispossessed. He takes on the persona of a slave and mockingly describes himself as forced to grovel before his clients to bend low and in a bondman's key with bated breath and whispered humbleness. Building on Amanda Bailey's reading, Shylock's self-fashioning as both proprietor and bondman becomes a strategic inversion of Venetian legal rationality, exposing how property discourse itself is contingent upon recognition rather than inherent right. If, as Edward Said insists, the intellectual must speak truth to power by unsettling normalized structures of domination, Shylock's courtroom rhetoric can be read as precisely such a disruptive intervention. He inhabits the very grammar of Venetian law, only to reveal its ethical bankruptcy. His insistence on the bond is not merely vengeful literalism, but a critical parody of a system that sanctifies contractual obligation while erasing the humanity of those who operate within it from the margins. In this sense, Shakespeare's Dissent is double-edged. He is at once complicit in and resistant to the mercantile logic he critiques. His performance of dispossession, as Bailey suggests, is less an internalization of subjugation than a calculated exposure of the performativity of status itself. Thus, Shylock emerges not simply as an organic intellectual in Gramscian terms, but as a precarious one, a figure whose critical consciousness is inseparable from the very structures that render him vulnerable. His tragedy, then, lies not only in his forced conversion or social exclusion, but in the foreclosure of his capacity to continue thinking publicly against the grain, a silencing that resonates uncannily with the disciplining of dissenting voices in contemporary neoliberal regimes. The author of Living Together, Living Apart, Rethinking Jewish-Christian Relations in the Middle Ages, Jonathan Eleukin's groundbreaking essay, Shylock, the Devil and the Meaning of Deception, in The Merchant of Venice, for European Judaism, a journal for the New Europe, as well as Shakespeare and the Jews, special supplement, casts aside racial and identitarian politics to unravel Shylockian exposition, espousing neither as the evil Jew nor as the victim of Christian anti-Semitism, as might be gleaned from the argumentative standpoints. In Marchant, Shakespeare, I believe, has created a secular version of this traditional motif of the struggle between Christ and the devil. Shylock was tricked into claiming Antonio, just as the devil was seduced into seizing Jesus. Ladies and gentlemen, both were deceived into thinking their victims were mortal, and both overreached. They then became vulnerable to justice from God and from Venice. Shakespeare infused the theology of the devil's deception into the language and structure of the play. The theological drama between God and the devil is not a passing image or allusion in the play to serve a more abstract notion of a confrontation between Judaism and Christianity, or between mercy and the law. It is the animating force of the play and possibly can lead us to Shakespeare's true concerns about the nature of human relationships and the possibility of earthly salvation. Virtually, all the characters in the play draw attention to the demonic aspects of Shylock's personality and behavior. Even when Shylock is not explicitly called a devil, Shakespeare makes him appear demonic. Shylock's incarnation of the devil is also apparent in Lorenzo's kidnapping of Jessica, which mimics the harrowing of hell when Jesus descended into Satan's kingdom to free the righteous souls who had died before the incarnation. We should remember too that the flight of Jessica and Lorenzo take place at Easter, this the time of the resurrection, and at a time when the devil should fear Christ's power. Shylock can feel a threat looming. Look to my house. I am loth to go. There is some ill brewing towards my rest, for I did dream of my money bags tonight. In this spirit, I doubt with skeptical misprision for Venetian jurisprudence to be a satire of anti-Semitic allegory, safeguarding the vindictiveness of the virtue of divine immortality as voiced by Portia's declamatory exclamations. As Portia warns Shylock, take then thy bond, take thou thy pound of flesh. But in the cutting it, if thou dost shed one drop of Christian blood, thy lands and goods are by the laws of Venice confiscate unto the state of Venice, which befalls upon the pacifist and anti-Zionist who preside rallies in solidarity with their counterparts, Palestinian brethren. In speculating the tragic irony of homelessness and unsettled belongingness, I project the devastation of tragedy incurred by Shylocks, who weren't willing to be reverts, ultimately expunging. He lost his very identity and power when condemned to become a Christian. His daughter also became a Christian and disowned him. He lost dominion over his property, his hellish house, and the future that Jessica offered him. Jessica, of course, deceives Shylock when she escapes with his jewels. Ladies and gentlemen, when read against Jonathan Lucian's theological reframing, however, this precarious intellectualism acquires an additional, more unsettling dimension. That is, Shylock's Dissent risks being subsumed within a dramaturgy that predetermines his failure as a necessary component of a larger soteriological design. If Shylock is figured, as Lucian suggests, within a secularized reenactment of the devil's deception, then his juridical insistence on the bond becomes legible only as a critique, but as overreach, an epistemic miscalculation that renders him intelligible to power precisely at the moment he seeks to resist it. In this light, dear guest, his thinking is structurally entrapped. What appears as rational ethical dissent is recoded by the play's theological undercurrent as demonic excess, thereby foreclosing the very possibility of this recognition as a legitimate intellectual agent. Sayed's model of the resistant intellectual presumes a space, however fraught, from which critiques may intervene, yet Shylock's condition suggests a more constrained horizon where dissent is anticipated, appropriated, and ultimately neutralized by the dominant order before it can effect transformation. His forced conversion thus signifies not merely a social or religious subjugation, but an epistemic erasure, the annihilation of a mode of reasoning that refuses to align with Christian humanist teleology. At the same time, this Eleukinian framework does not simply invalidate Shylock's status as a dissident thinker. Rather, it sharpens the tragic irony of his position, for if his role is already inscribed within a narrative of deception and divine justice, then his attempts at ethical reasoning, his appeal to shared humanity, his insistence on contractual equity becomes acts of resistance that are doomed to misrecognition from the outset. The Venetian court's judgment, framed as triumph of mercy over law, reveals itself instead as a disciplinary mechanism that reasserts theological and juridical sovereignty by recasting this dissent as deviance. In this sense, Shylock embodies the limits of Gramscian organic intellectualism under conditions where hegemonic power operates, not only through economic and legal structures, but through narrative and theological encoding. Dignified delegates and fellow colleagues, his tragedy then lies in the impossibility of sustaining a critical voice within a system that has already scripted his speech as error, his logic as excess, and his identity as expendable, a predicament that resonates with contemporary forms of intellectual precarity, where dissenting voices are simultaneously solicited and suppressed within the circuits of global power. From the perspectives of Shylock and the Nashis, continuation or reinvention in European Judaism, a journal for the New Europe as well as Shakespeare and the Jews special supplement, Alessandro Besset's examination of Shakespeare's plays in autocratic contexts such as Auschwitz and Holocaust infers as vengeful martyr, demonic clown, tragic hero, and clownish fool. Read alongside Alessandro Besset's analysis of Shylock's performative afterlives under fascist regimes. The precariousness of Shylock's intellectual dissent becomes even more starkly overdetermined by the politics of representation itself. The historical oscillation she traces between Shylock as vengeful martyr, demonic clown, tragic hero, and clownish fool reveals not merely interpretive plurality but the ideological capture of his figure within regimes that instrumentalize him to consolidate power. The most fundamental difference between Cordner's and Cross's Shylock lay in their interpretation of the character rather than in their physical appearance. Gardner attempted to portray Shylock as the only true believer in the play, and his deeply rooted Jewishness was supposed to undermine and expose the false Christianity of his counterpart. Gardner's Shylock wore sidelocks, a symbol of an observant Jew, with a prayer shawl draped over his head. When in prayer, his piety was supposed to bestow more gravity and seriousness onto Shylock, contrasting him with the frivolous, exultant Venetians. Cross's blatant Jewishness, in contrast, was meant to ridicule, humiliate, and dehumanize him, ensuring and manifesting the Venetian Christian and ultimately Aryan triumph over Judaism and the Hebrewite himself. While the Nazi regime prided itself on supposedly breaking with previous traditions of playing Shylock as a tragic hero, it becomes clear that by portraying Shylock as a comic simpleton, they nonetheless continued with some of the staging traditions that were popular before 1933. Throughout the performance history of Shylock, and especially during the 20th century, one can find a dichotomy of vengeful, villainous Shylocks and tragic victims, falling prey to unjust and prejudiced oppressors. And while these contrasting interpretations were still possible before 1933, Hitler's ascension to power eliminated Shylock the tragic hero and imposed upon the audiences a ridiculed clown, a beast, and a mere pawn in the plot of the lives of the rich and glamorous Venetians. Dear guests, what this genealogy of performance underscores is that Shylock's capacity to function as a dissenting, Saadian intellectual is not only intellectually constrained, as Eleukin suggests, but theatrically and historically foreclosed through regimes of enforced caricature. The Nazi reduction of Shylock to a comic simpleton does not merely distort Shakespeare's character, it systematically evacuates the epistemic force of his critique, transforming reasoned dissent into spectacle and thereby neutralizing its threat. Even Fred Courtness's recuperative attempt, while restoring gravity, risks reinscribing Shylock within a moral binary that stabilizes rather than destabilizes Christian hypocrisy. In this sense, Shylock's intellectual labor, his insistence on law, reciprocity, and recognition, remains perpetually vulnerable to appropriation, whether as demonic excess, tragic pathos, and/or ideological caricature. His afterlives thus testify to a broader condition of intellectual precarity in which dissenting voices are not only silenced but re-scripted, their meanings re-engineered to serve the very hegemonies they seek to contest. Well, dear audience, encountering the animadversion and misdemeanor of Porcius's judgment as transvestite young doctor of attorney, Balthazar Dagne M.H. Boable points out in Shylock and Portia, Secret Sharers. Portia plays legal hardball. She carefully constructs a deadly legal trap for him. Under the law, he has no right even to leave. That is for Shylock. Bassanio is him, and Bassanio is ready to give him the principal and let him go. But Portia notes that he has refused it in the open court. He shall have merely justice and his bond. Since he is an alien who has sought the life of any citizen, his goods are forfeit, and his life lies in the mercy of the Duke only. I find difficult to believe, however, that even a Renaissance audience would have viewed forced conversion in that way, since during the Crusades, thousands of Jews died for refusing to give up their faith. Shylock is defeated by his double. This is the ring that Portia tricks him into giving away. If the ring is a vaginal symbol, as the final lines of the play seem to indicate, then his acceptance of the ring deprives him of phallic power and prerogatives. His loss of the ring is a symbolic loss of chastity, a loss of for which women traditionally paid heavily, but which was viewed casually or even honorifically in men. Upon Bassanio's unfaithful disposition of the ring, which she has manipulated, Portia negates her place to be directed and asserts her sexual independence. She tells Bassanio, I'll become as liberal as you. Finally, and perhaps most important, through her carefully constructed legal trap, Portia forces Bassanio to see her as she is, as both his wife and learned doctor. Sweet doctor, you shall be my bedfellow when I am absent and lie with my wife. Dear guests, Shylock, when read against this meticulously staged juridical ambush, emerges less as a monolithic emblem of vengeance than as a precarious humanist intellectual, one who clings to the very discourse of law and equity that ultimately engineers his undoing. In the scene whereas as Deg Dagne M.H. Bubble observes Portia plays legal hardball. The irony is acute. Shylock's insistence on contractual justice signals not barbarity but a rigorous, almost scholastic faith in the universality of law, an ideal deeply consonant with Renaissance humanism, yet this faith proves tragically asymmetrical. While he inhabits the law as an ethical absolute, Portia, in her guise as Balthazar, instrumentalizes it as rhetoric, converting jurisprudence into a theatrical and gendered performance of power. Thus, Shylock's intellectualism becomes precarious precisely because it is unshielded by the privileges that enable Porcius's interpretive elasticity. His refusal of Bassanio's offer, his demand for the bond may be read not merely as obstinacy, but as an epistemic commitment to a system that promises impartiality yet operates through exclusion. In this sense, his defeat by his double is not only psychological but hermeneutic. He is outraged, outmaneuvered, and ultimately displaced within the very semiotic field he trusts. That is, ladies and gentlemen, the forced conversion moreover intensifies this humanist tragedy, transforming a figure who asserts identity through legal reason into one stripped of both civic and spiritual autonomy. Even the symbolic economy of the ring, as Bible suggests, underscores a gendered inversion that further marginalizes Shylock's position. While Portia negotiates and reclaims agency through performative exchange, Shylock's loss signifies an irreversible disposition. Consequently, Shylock stands as a liminal thinker, committed to ideals of justice, reciprocity, and recognition, yet fatally exposed within a polity that denies him the very humanist universality he invokes. In a contradistinctive frame, Shylock may be productively paralleled not only as a precarious humanist, but as the inverse double of multiple figures who inhabit, manipulate, and or transcend the same ethical and juridical terrain he reverses. Unlike Portia, whose juridical eloquence depends upon elasticity, theatricality, and sovereign privilege, Shylock remains bound to a literalist hermeneutics that exposes the limits of humanist universalism when divorced from power. Where she performs law, he believes in it. In contrast to Antonio, whose melancholic lurges cloaks a structurally sanctioned violence against the alien, Shylock's insistence on the bond becomes a counter-ethics of visibility, an attempt to render explicit the covert economies of mercy and credit that exclude him. Dear guests, similarly, when set against Basanius's prodigal effect-driven economy of risk and reward, Shylock's calculus appears austere yet intellectually coherent, privileging contractual reciprocity over aristocratic improvisation. One might even read him against figures such as Hamlet, whose philosophical hesitation fractures action. Shylock, by contrast, collapses contemplation into an unyielding praxis, thereby revealing not indecision but an overdetermined commitment to principle. Conversely, in relation to King Lear, whose tragic disposition emerges from misrecognition and effective excess, Shylock's downfall stems from hyper-recognition. His acute awareness of injury calcifies into a juridical absolutism that forecloses mercy. Dear guests, I argue even alongside Othello, another racialized outsider, Shylock diverges markedly. When Othello internalizes the epistemic violence of Venetian society and turns it inward, Shylock externalizes grievance through the law, seeking redress rather than self-annihilation. Thus, these contradistinctive analogies illuminate Shylock as a figure whose tragedy does not lie in excess passion or moral blindness alone, but in a paradoxical fidelity to rational structures that fail to accommodate his subjectivity, rendering him neither villain nor victim in isolation, but a critical index of the fractures within Renaissance humanism itself. Concluding the enlightenment of the Renaissance within the backdrop of Venice in anti-theoretical counterfoiling, Belmont and I, and counterfoiling Belmont, I thus cite the critical interpretation of Jean R. Cooper, Shylock's humanity. Even with Shylock's conversion, all is not well in Venice. We do not find Christian ideal embodied there, but only in Belmont, where even a Christian bigot like Gratiano must mind his manners and conform to the harmony of the place. In conclusion, the Renaissance promise of enlightenment grounded in ideals of human dignity, rational justice, and ethical universality finds itself fractured within the bifurcated geographies of Venice and Belmont, where the former operates as a site of juridical rigidity and exclusion, and the latter as an aestheticized enclave of humanity and selective humanism. As John R. Cooper incisively observes, even with Shylock's conversion, all is not well in Venice. We do not find the Christian ideal embodied there, but only in Belmont, that where even a Christian bigot like Gratiano must mind his manners and conform to the harmony of the place, thereby exposing the dissonance between professed ideology and lived praxis. Venice, despite its cosmological veneer, ultimately betrays the limits of Renaissance humanism by subjecting Shylock to a coercive assimilation that nullifies rather than affirms his humanity, revealing a legal system complicit in cultural erasure. Belmont, by contrast, stages an idealized, almost European resolution, yet its harmony is predicated upon containment and performance, not genuine inclusivity. Thus, the play does not resolve, but rather displaces the ethical contradictions of its age, suggesting that Renaissance enlightenment, far from being a stable moral achievement, remains contingent, exclusionary, and deeply entangled with structures of power. In these unresolved tension, Shylock's silence presents lingers as a critical reminder that the era's most celebrated ideals falter precisely where they are most needed. And that's my work cited. And I thank you all for listening to me so patiently. Till next time, adieu.